So Engels was born, you see the next slide. Engels was born in 1820 in a place called Barmen in what's now Germany. He's someone who I describe as a traitor to his class. He's a great example of someone who's from quite a wealthy background, but was nevertheless committed to workers' struggles and to social justice throughout his life. His father was an industrialist who owned kind of a mill that produced cotton thread. When he was fairly young, he took an interest in radical ideas. As a young man, he went to Berlin, the capital of Germany, and he went to do military service there, but he took the opportunity to go out and enjoy drinking and fencing and smoking. Show the next slide. It's just a picture of him as a young man. But at the time, in universities, anyone who lived in the city could go and attend lectures at a university. It was quite different to kind of neoliberal universities now, where you pay £9,000 a year. So he took the opportunity to go and watch lectures and take an interest in some of the philosophical ideas at the time. And he came across a group of people called the Young Hegelians. These were a group of young philosophers who had looked to the ideas of the great German philosopher Hegel and interpreted Hegel's ideas in a very radical way. This is kind of where the idea of left and right comes from. You get right Hegelians who interpret Hegel in a conservative way, and left Hegelians who interpret him in a radical way. These people were interested in ideas about the world being in a constant process of change and transformation. They were interested in ideas about changing the world. On the next slide, there's a little sketch that Engels did of some of his friends having a big argument over some drinks about some philosophical debate, with a squirrel in the top left corner as well for some reason. But I think it's important to note that there was a lot of censorship at the time, so you couldn't openly talk about philosophy. You certainly couldn't talk about kind of atheist ideas and ideas about religion. So these debates that people were having often kind of took the form of kind of cultural debates, but they were really about politics and philosophy. The year after that, something happened that changed Engels' life in quite a big way, which is that he came to Britain and specifically came to Manchester. Mark's going to talk quite a lot more about this, but I think this is where when he came to Manchester, he wrote one of his best works, I think, even when he was pretty young, when he was still 24, he wrote The Condition of the Working Class in England, talked about the living conditions and working conditions that people lived in the 1840s, the terrible pollution, terrible housing that people had to live in. He used the word social murder, which we still use today, to describe conditions that the ruling class put people in that they can't hope to survive. He also talked about pandemics as well, actually, and infectious diseases. Back at the time, it was things like cholera and typhus that people were very concerned about and that were disproportionately affecting the poor. After he returned from Manchester, he met back up with Karl Marx. Next slide. Karl Marx was someone who he would, of course, spend much of the rest of his time with throughout the rest of his life. They worked together on joint writing projects, and really had quite similar ideas about the world. And around this kind of time, this around 1845, they started to develop their philosophy, and they actually started to distinguish their philosophy from the ideas of the young Hegelians, and started to differentiate themselves a bit from those other philosophers. They developed what's called historical materialism. Without going into it in too much detail, it's a way of thinking about history that starts from real human beings and real human needs and how they fulfill those needs, how different types of societies are organised in different ways in order to meet human needs. They came to the kind of realisation that it's not ideas that drive society forwards. The young Hegelians were very interested in rationality and rational ideas, and society would kind of progress as people looked to more rational ideas. Those philosophers tended to be a bit kind of sniffy about the working class. They tended to see the sort of working masses as the enemies of reason, really. Whereas for Marx and Engels, it's the working class that are going to change society, because workers play that particular role within the system. They both started to realise this. Engels, through his observations of the working class in Britain and his engagement with the workers' movement here in Britain, and Marx through his own writing on workers' struggles, particularly something called the Silesian Weavers' strike, which took place in what is now Poland. So they realise they have a pretty similar view of the world and start to work together. As well as, I think the next slide is one of their joint philosophical works, the German ideology. Engels' handwriting on the left there, and a lot of scribbles. They spent a lot of long nights trying to work together on this big project of developing their philosophy, which was never published, but kind of served as a guide to their own thought. But as well as thinking about philosophy, they were also actively involved in politics. They started to describe themselves as communists, and they thought that communists should organise together with other people that share similar ideas. Although it's not always easy, as we know, to try and build these build revolutionary organisations. It can be very tough, but they took seriously the idea of trying to link up lots of people who share these ideas. They became part of something called the League of the Just, and they managed to kind of win a leadership position within this organisation. And they were tasked with drawing up a statement of the group's politics, which became the Communist Manifesto. Engels actually played a big part in producing the Communist Manifesto. He wrote the kind of first draft of it, which is called Principles of Communism. You can still read it online. So if you want a kind of bullet point analysis of what it is that we think about capitalism and how we want to change it, that's still a really useful short guide to these ideas. Talked about kind of traditional demands. What would housing look like in a socialist society? What would education look like? Talked about the different types of socialists that exist out there, and how revolutionaries can relate to people that have different ideas. Kind of reformist socialists that accept to some extent the capitalist system and want to try to reform it from within. About a spectre haunting Europe, and I think these words would be prophetic, because in the following year, 1848, revolution breaks out across Europe. The next slide is a picture from France, but this is not just in France. It's kind of I'd say the sort of centre of the 1814 revolutions is in Paris, but it covers a huge swathe of Europe. There are monarchies being overthrown across the continent. There's a nationalist revolt in Hungary. There's a revolt in Vienna. In France, the barricades were put up. King was overthrown, forced into exile in Britain. These revolutions quite often involved a sort of alliance of liberal reformers and more radical forces, where the liberals kind of want things like free speech and freedom of assembly and a free press, whereas the radicals wanted a much deeper change in society. They wanted, they wanted to be able to eat and feed their families, really. But in order to do that, you need to completely change the type of society that you live in. Ultimately, it's not enough just to have free speech and freedom of the press, even though those things are, of course, important. So you have this alliance of different groups with different interests. That alliance started to fall apart, most strikingly in France, where you end up with actually the National Assembly being elected once the king has been forced into exile. But then that National Assembly then turns on the workers' revolt and suppresses any kind of attempt to deepen the revolution and spread it into a more socialist revolution. Ends with the National Guard actually putting down the workers' revolt and killing people. A new Napoleon is elected, and you get a return to the kind of forces of reaction in power, and there were counter-revolutions all across Europe. The next slide. So whereas Engels, in all of this, Engels was actually actively involved in these revolutions. He actually, took up arms to try and defend the Frankfurt Assembly in, what's now Germany, of course, against the Prussian state. So he, led a little troop of soldiers, and actually was pretty good in battle, apparently. But this was ultimately unsuccessful, and he was, driven into exile back in Britain, as was Marx eventually. But I think what's important to take away from this is that ideas about revolution were tested in these circumstances. Marx and Engels started to recognise the need for independent organisations of workers. They work with other forces, specifically liberals at strategic points in this, but they also need their own organisations to push these revolutions further. This is, an idea that was taken up by Leon Trotsky when he talked about permanent revolution. So, kind of in the wake of the sort of failure of 1848, what I'll just conclude on was that revolutionaries were in exile all over Europe. They were refugees, but struggle did come back again. They managed to regroup, and Marx and Engels were part of something called the International Working Men's Association, what we'd call the First International now. So they were able to build again and regroup their forces on the back of a kind of recognition of the need for internationalism among the working class. So they were able to build a movement that could support working class struggles in other parts of Europe. They had the Paris Commune in 1871 that Marx and Engels also wrote about and expressed their solidarity with. The next slide, I think, actually kind of shows how Engels actually lived a long time. He lived into the 1890s, and he saw the beginnings of what he called new unionisms and the the start of union movements in Britain, and the beginnings of what would become the Labour Party here in Britain. That slide is a picture of Engels at the back on the left and Marx on the right, and Marx's three daughters. Engels was spending a lot of his money supporting the Marx family back in Britain at this time, both financially and kind of working with Marx on their theoretical contribution. Eleanor Marx, the youngest daughter in the middle, would go on to become a really important union leader, of course. So kind of, and the final picture is Engels with some of the leaders of German revolutionary movement. Engels is at the back in the middle with the big beard, and to the left, as we see it, is Clara Zetkin, and to the right is Julia Bebel and August Bebel, an important German revolutionary leader. So I don't have much time left, but it kind of, when Marx and Engels were in Britain, Marx was kind of concentrating on capital. Engels wrote on a whole range of other subjects, including science, nature, housing, military history. He talked about the family as well, and anthropology, which we're going to hear more about. But he's often seen as a second fiddle to Marx. Sorry?
Can you wind up, please?
Yeah, he's seen as a second fiddle to Marx, but he's actually a really important revolutionary in his own right. And yeah, I'll end on that.